In this session, Donald Davidson talks philosophy with his teacher and long-standing friend, W.V. Quine. The discussion focuses on two broad areas of philosophy: empiricism, in which Quine is mainly interviewed by Davidson, and truth, where Quine conducts the questioning. In these important discussions, major differences between these two highly influential philosophers are highlighted, and some of their differences are brought to an apparent resolution. In response to Quine's opening question, Davidson clearly states his chief criticism of Quine's approach to philosophy. He charges that Quine, like all empiricists, is committed to an undesirable third dogma of empiricism. This is the view that all our empirical knowledge is based upon something non-propositional, that is, given to us by the senses. As this criticism is elaborated, we see the extent to which Quine's views about the source of empirical knowledge have changed, from his famous paper Two Dogmas of Empiricism, Through Word and Object, and up to his most recent writings. Quine suggests that he no longer holds a third dogma of empiricism, but he maintains nonetheless that he is still an empiricist. The discussion ends with a dispute about what it is to be an empiricist, and Davidson's exclamation, and I quote, "We're in agreement, completely. It only took 50 years. In the second part of the program, Quine questions Davidson on his views about truth. Both philosophers agree that truth is always relative to a language, but Quine holds that it is also relative to a chosen manual of translation. This leads to a lively discussion encompassing both the connections between truth and translation and the importance of a Tarski-style definition of truth. The program ends with questions from the invited audience, from David Papineau of King's College, London, from the philosopher and broadcaster Brian McGee, and from Colin Howson of the London School of Economics. We join the discussion now at the London School of Economics. I'm delighted to introduce my next discussant on the session on the work of Donald Davidson. He, I can't say, is an old friend of mine, which I'm sure Donald can say with his hand on his heart, but I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with him. Now it's over a period of a few years since the project that we worked on together, in conversation, Willard, Van Orman, Quine, as it was. And I'm absolutely delighted that he's come here today. He's made a special trip from his planned itinerary to come here for his great but close friend and pupil, Donald Davidson. So without dragging any of this off, since the time is valuable, and I'm sure you want to hear our honored guest, I'd like to give you Professor Quine, Emeritus Professor at Harvard University, and our guest today. It's a privilege, and I want to get out of the way and let him get close to his friend. If you sit here, okay. And be careful on the wires.
Well, along the middle of the century, I came out against what I called two dogmas of empiricism. One was the dichotomy, the basic dichotomy, professedly, of truths into the analytic, or ones that depended only on the meanings of the words, and the synthetic ones, which had some factual content. And the other dogma was the dogma of reductionism, in the sense of there being a separable empirical content to any meaningful synthetic statement, which could be isolated independently of surrounding statements. And then more recently, Don, you came out against an alleged third dogma, and it's not altogether clear to me what that is.
Good. I'll do my best. I think I heard about the first two dogmas in about 1940. I've never deviated from the straight path with respect to them. The third one, I learned, or thought I learned when I was a graduate student, to be against not only reductionism, but the idea that all of our empirical knowledge, anyway, is based on something which is not itself propositional in character, something that's given by the senses, call it what you will, experience, percepts, impressions, sense data, there are all these different things. The search for something of this kind is easy to understand. If we just start out with beliefs, we wonder how they're attached or get attached to the world. So we want something that lies behind them that will justify them. Nevertheless, I became convinced then, I guess partly anyway, by Sellers' article on the myth of the given, that there was nothing we could find that satisfied these two conditions. On the one hand, it would justify our empirical beliefs, and on the other hand, it wouldn't be propositional in character. Because if it wasn't propositional in character, then it seemed it couldn't stand in a relation of justification. So I remember reading some of the logical positivists that seemed to me to be having trouble with this very issue. One of my teachers was C.I. Lewis, and he certainly had something like sense data. So there was the school of sense data and the like on the one hand, and those who were against it, and had to try to come up with something different. The third dogma of empiricism I've just described. That is, it's the idea that somehow in experience we are given something which is not propositional, but which nevertheless justifies our empirical beliefs. Now, you, Van, were very cagey about this. You gave up on sense data and any of these other things, and had an alternative approach, which in the end I decided nevertheless had the seeds of the same mistake or confusion. Now, it's perhaps not too long a story to say how it seemed to me this was still there. Of course, there were phrases in well, let's start with two dogmas. In two dogmas, there was the totality of our beliefs on the one hand, and on the other hand, there was experience pressing in from the outside, and the relationship was holistic, so that you couldn't track down the empirical content, especially to more theoretical senses, to any particular place on the periphery, as it was then metaphorically described. But nevertheless, there was the tribunal of experience. And I remember way back then, because you may not remember this, but I actually read the manuscript of Two Dogmas in 1950, before you gave it, when you came to the south of France and stayed with me and my then wife.
Oh, so
during that summer. You had it with you. I read it.
oh,
And I worried about that tribunal of experience. Does it speak up? Okay, if it speaks up, then it's got propositional content. But no, propositions started one stage further in. So the question is, well, what exactly is the relationship between the tribunal of experience and observation sentences, which lie right there on the periphery? Now, by all of that was a metaphor, and in fact, it only came in at the very end as a kind of way of summing up an attitude rather than a doctrine. And in Word and Object, this got cashed out to a certain extent, although we still were often regaled with phrases like the totality of our data come from the stimulations of our senses, all of the evidence that we have, so forth. And I remember stewing really for years about what exactly is the evidence in this theory. It isn't the actual firings of the nerve endings. That's not the evidence. If we start with observation sentences and say they are the evidence, not that they express the evidence, but that they are the evidence, that doesn't seem to be the right category for something to be evidence. And I remember writing at some point there, as far as I can see, Quine doesn't have anything that really should be called the ultimate evidence. He has no theory of evidence, and he agreed with this. I hope you still do.
yes, I certainly don't speak of experience anymore if I'm on my guard. I think my attitude here is closer to Popper in the sense of stressing refutation rather than evidence and support. And the refutation comes in predicting something which is describable in an observation sentence, a sentence that would be agreed to by all observers who are familiar with the language. These are the ultimate checkpoints, as I see it, and that's where the empirical content comes into our theory of nature. The term evidence itself, I don't think plays a essential role, I don't think it's a supporting member of the structure anymore for me. If it ever was really, it certainly would seem so in that last page of Two Dogmas. But certainly the simply from a naturalistic point of view, we need to find out, or we want to find out what the mechanism is of our finding out about the world, external world. This is simply a causal matter, which involves the neural receptors and the internal neural hookup. But the empirical, insofar as there is an empirical content, it operates at these checkpoints, which are just here and there. It's what keeps our theory honest. What to call evidence in the sense of what would we observe first, and then it leads us to make a conjecture. um, is less easy to say. We are guided partly by our observations, partly by canons of simplicity, symmetry, the sort of thing that makes a theory appeal to us, and to what extent that is dependable. Well, I think there's still some unsolved problems there. I'm wondering in view of all this, whether I still hold the third dogma or not.
Well, I think it's a good question, because one of the ways in which I thought I could show that you did, you've given up, I think, and that has to do with how do we determine the content of observation sentences, and at one time it was determined by patterns of stimulation at the skin or wherever, and there's more to the story which I can tell if necessary. You've partly given that up. That is, the patterns of stimulation, the actual patterns, have only a very remote connection with the actual contents, which are geared to distal objects and so forth. Now, that in itself is to give up, in that area anyway, what I call the dogma of empiricism.
Well, yes, let's see in what sense I give that up. I would see it as, in this sense, recognizing, which was a problem back in Word and Object, recognizing that there need be and probably is no substantial homology between one individual's receptors and the neural hookup and another's. And in fact, it's in one of the earliest pages of Darwin's Origin of Species that he says regarding insects. He says even these simple creatures have decidedly unlike neural patterns, neural hookups, one from another. And yet we do somehow agree on in our responses. We learn to agree in our responses to distal objects, as if those distal objects were flashed on us with pretty much identical projections, which they're presumably not. In Word and Object, faced with this problem, I assumed the homology, but I was uncomfortable with it, and then finally, in fact, on your urging, I gave it up, but it left that question then hanging fire, and it wasn't until some years later that I began to see my way through that, namely in terms of a pre-established harmony, to borrow Leibniz's phrase, but a pre-established harmony which, unlike Leibniz's, was explicable causally without divine intervention, and namely through natural selection and adaptation of our standards of similarity with the environment, quite independently of whether there's a neural matching to any appreciable degree between one individual's intake and another. Perhaps that is the conclusion that the third dogma, that I don't hold that dogma myself. You've said that now that the third dogma is gone, really empiricism itself is gone. And I certainly haven't viewed it that way. I continue to view myself as an empiricist. But where I have this lingering empiricism, which I think is vital, is with respect to these checkpoints. That we don't have an out-and-out coherentist epistemology, a way of knowing. But our procedure is tied to nature, just in that now and then we can derive something from our theory, which we can check to our satisfaction. At least we can be fairly sure that it's wrong, that the cluster of hypotheses which together have implied this experimental setup is wrong, has some false hypotheses in it. And if we don't find that conflict, then things are all right up to the next inquiry, next test. I'm not persuaded even that the negative result is conclusive. That's a point where I certainly have eased up, but that the conclusiveness of the observation sentences themselves grades off, and it's a matter of the degree to which theory has infused into these sentences. But there is simply, observably, and a tendency to firm agreement among observers on certain reports and not others, an immediate agreement among those who command the language. And well, I would say this was a lingering trace of empiricism.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. So if that's empiricism, I'm an empiricist too. I was counting somebody as an empiricist only if, in effect, they thought there was some epistemically significant intermediary between the world and beliefs about it. And let's just take observation sentences, however exactly we pick them out in a graded classification anyway. But is there something that happens in between that is what we really use as evidence for what's beyond? Something that's somehow given by the senses, all right. That's what I was calling the dogma of empiricism, the third dogma. And I thought you were originally stuck with something that was like that when you were counting the contents of observation sentences as being given by, that is defined by, the patterns of stimulation that cause them, and therefore something personal, not public at all, but something personal. So that's my idea of old-fashioned empiricism, and as I remember once long ago quizzing you about this and saying, but isn't your notion of stimulus meaning just doing the same sort of work that sense data did before? And you said, yes, that's the whole idea. Let's find something that's scientifically respectable, namely sense organs being stimulated in place of sense data. But you wanted them to do the same work, that is to serve as somehow allowing us to introduce something that would count as data, evidence, or something of that sort for our beliefs. Now you've removed that or let's say you've moved it to the outside world, and that now it seems to me it's not like old-fashioned empiricism anymore. It's naturalism, and that seems to me fine.
Good. Well, in Word and Object, already in my discussion of translation, for instance, and even in my concept of observation sentences, it was always distal. It was always about the external world.
Sure.
The observation sentences themselves, it's raining, that's mama, and so on. But there was the problem of the meeting of minds,
Right.
and this at that point in Word and Object, this lame device for accommodating it, namely assuming that there must be, in essential respects, physiological homology between the receptors of one person and those of another. Giving that up, first just giving it up and wondering, all right, how do we account for agreement? And then seeing finally how we do in terms of ultimately of natural selection. That rounds out that picture, but I think a good part of this transition was in the 50s between Word and Object, 1950, and Two Dogmas, 1950, and Word and Object, 1960.
I found much of Roots of Reference was rather going back and forth between using stimulus meaning still as an important complex and really just explaining the contents of observation sentences in terms of distal stimuli. And some passages did it one way and some did it another way. I always try to encourage the distal one.
I even found it in Roots of Reference, a page where I come very close to this what I now view as the solution,
Right.
Namely the harmony of subjective standards of perceptual similarity between individuals, an intersubjective harmony of these subjective standards, and finally that gets explained by natural selection, the environment being the shared thing rather than the receptors. The environment, that is to say, shared by our ancestors far enough back so that natural selection could do its work.
Well, all that seems to be exactly right, and indeed, I've thought that was the right way to go for a long time. It just the thing that needs emphasis from my point of view, anyway, is we don't have any way of pulling together the various things that go into stimulus, the old idea of stimulus meaning. We don't have any way of pulling that together except by talking about the distal objects. I mean, that's where the convergence comes, as you're now saying. So it's not as though there's some way in which, as philosophers, we can study how it is that the different patterns of stimulation, nevertheless, the particular class of stimulations that do prompt us to give similar responses as table, glass, pitcher, and so forth. We just say, well, that's how it came out. And much of that, of course, can be partially explained, or maybe a great deal can be explained by people who know much more neurology and wiring of the brain and that sort of thing than we do. But our explanation of what patterns go together, so to speak, to produce the same response, we just say, well, what brings them together is the sameness of the response. Not only the sameness of my responses, because I respond to the very different patterns in somewhat the same way, never mind what the lighting is, never mind the perspective, never mind the distance. People get a person response under all these different conditions, but furthermore, you do the same thing. All of this has a natural explanation, but it doesn't seem to me to be empiricism anymore in one of its most characteristic phases, namely somehow there's a subjective or personal thing from which I build up the whole picture of the world. Here the picture of the world is being built up on the basis of something that we share with each other.
Yes, good. The divergence from a overwhelming empiricism, perhaps, is that within the scope of the checkpoints, there can be such a tremendous variation in all the superstructure, all the theory, all the natural science that systematizes and brings together our observations. And this, in fact, is the sort of thing that made me make the conjecture, anyway, of the indeterminacy of translation of theoretical sentences.
Van, there's this recent short article of yours in the Journal of Philosophy in which you announce the discovery of the distal object. And you say, all right, now this goes for understanding another person, that is for our theory of meaning, so to speak. But you say, with respect to epistemology, I'm still for working with the proximal stimulus. And now, I wonder what you meant by that at this point, because you've always insisted, and it seems to me absolutely rightly, that theory of meaning and epistemology have to go hand in hand. It's a major theme of roots of reference, but still popped up again and again and again. Now it looks as if they're going in two different directions. And I wonder if that, I mean, you said so little about it that I'd like to get that straight, or let me say, I'll urge you to bring the two back together again.
Yes, now what did I have in mind there? The causal account of learning and of projecting a theory, and this I viewed as a naturalization of epistemology. Mm-hmm. And I think of myself then as a naturalized empiricist. And so I think of the causal account as a central part of naturalized epistemology.
Well, certainly the senses play a causal role in our learning or knowing anything about the outside world. But do they play an epistemic part? That is, can we say at some particular stage in this causal process, which begins with the world and ends up with beliefs, is there some intermediate stage where we can say something about here's an epistemological event or layer that's in between out there and belief?
I don't see where it would be, no.
now we can stop because we're in agreement completely. Only took 50 years.
Progressive more. Yes, another point I'd like cleared up is in what sense your view of truth is transcendent rather than immanent?
Well, these aren't my words. Transcendent.
Oh, is it?
Heavens no. The word never crossed my lips.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
No, it's immanent. Of course, if we're talking about language, truth is relative to language, even relative to the individual's language. That's the immanence, but not, I would say, in any sense that I understand, relative to something like a conceptual scheme. Given what our sentences mean on occasion, they're just true or false, or anyway, they have fixed truth conditions. And is that transcendent? It's non-relative. The truth of our beliefs is non-relative. I mean, they just are true, or not. At least they have truth conditions. I mean, I don't want to insist that they're always either true or false. Maybe some of them are neither, but I mean, that's just a side issue. But they're truth conditions. We know what it would be for our beliefs to be true, and if they are true, they're simply true. There's nothing relative about that.
You regard the content of the notion of truth as given completely by disquotation?
In one sense, well, there's a lot that doesn't give us. Disquotation only works where the language we're referring to is the same language that we're using. And in many cases, anyway, we can't take that for granted. I mean, if I'm talking about the truth of something you said, disquotation can't be taken for granted. Maybe you meant the same thing that I mean, and so I can say, well, that sentence of yours is true if and only if. But I'm talking about your language. I'm using mine, and it's an empirical assumption that your sentence meant the same thing as mine does.
Quite so, and so I think of truth of a foreign sentence as dependent on a parameter, which is the chosen manual of translation. Mm-hmm. And given the conjecture of the indeterminacy of translation, that the choice of becomes an essential parameter. Yes, well, that relativity to translation certainly is clear. There's another aspect which gives truth the feeling of transcendence, certainly, and I've wondered whether this is the whole thing. Namely, when science takes a turn, and something that had been accepted by the scientists is rejected in view of some unexpected observations, and it comes to be rated as false. We don't say that even we naturalists who think of science as the last arbiter insofar as there is one, don't say that it used to be true, but turned out to be it used to be true, but turned out to be false. We say rather that we used to think it was true, but it was always false. And that again is subject to what happens next time around. Now here is a respect in which truth does go, even truth within the language, go beyond mere disquotation, and a respect in which it might be regarded as transcendent rather than immanent then if one continues to speak in those terms. But on the other hand, since I can see it only as a peculiarity of the idiom, it seems a little shallow compared to what we are apt to think of as truth uncritically.
Let me pick up on the idea of truth relative to a translation manual. Does that mean that when we're talking about the truth of something somebody else says, that it's relative to two things, to the language and to the translation manual, or is it just one thing? I mean, my view would be there's just one thing.
And what's that one thing?
The one thing is the language. I mean, we can name it as we please. I think what we want to understand is a person, and there isn't a thing called a language in addition. We have a way of interpreting. If we have one way, we've got other ways that we could have used. Mm-hmm. Whether we count a given utterance as having these truth conditions or those depends upon what language we interpret them as speaking. And that's it. I mean, that's a relativity. Okay. But there isn't a second one now. And we always knew that truth was relative to a language. So that we take for granted. So I don't think there are two different things that's relative to, just one.
Well, yes, this is the way I view it. Also, what would these two be? On the one hand, there's disquotation. That's for the language itself. Then if you're going to speak of a sentence in another language as true, that's going to be relative to your translation of that language or that ultimately that individual's idiolect into your own.
Right.
There's that one. Well, now the two things that it's relative to, as I've been breaking it down, is one, one's own language via disquotation. Second, the manual of translation in the case of it being in another language.
Good. I think that's exactly right. Disquotation, though, isn't really doing all that much work because it's for my own idiolect right now. Mm-hmm. And that's the best it can do. But here I have this notion of truth, which I certainly am applying to somebody else. In fact, I can't really make anything out of what they're talking about if I can't decide one way or another what the truth conditions of their utterances are. So that has to be a notion of truth that transcends what disquotation is giving. It's disquotation, if you want to think of it this way, plus interpretation. I mean, we don't have two different notions of truth.
Well, so we're saying of this foreigner who's uttered something, we quote that in his put quotation marks around just a transcription direct in his language, and we're saying that's true if and only if, and then comes his sentence again. But then we have the further question, so what? What does that mean? And then we translate. There are those two steps.
Well, yes, you can, another way of thinking of it, which seems to me equivalent in many ways anyway, is I want to understand this person. I say, well, here's my theory, or here's what I assume I know. If he utters that sentence, then it's true if and only if so-and-so. And that's what I believe. I'm not translating. If I write down that piece of wisdom, of course, it's going to concern two idiolects, mine and his. But my knowledge is just what the truth conditions, or my view is what the truth conditions of what he said are these. That's the content of my belief or my knowledge. And I agree with you. If there's one total interpretive scheme that works, there'll be lots of others. And they may differ to the extent of actually counting certain of his utterances true on one of the accounts and false on another, where I would have made up the slack with other sentences and his beliefs and so forth.
Yes. Yes, the parameter has to be, strictly speaking, has to be the idiolect at the moment.
Right. Mm-hmm. But let's see. I'll try to find a difference here between us, because so far I think we're in agreement. If you think of a theory about what somebody else means as taking a fairly comprehensive form, I mean, I'm not just have a theory about what one utterance means, but about what a lot of other utterances do mean or would mean. Or let's see, I put this in terms of sentences. If he were to utter such a sentence, it would have these truth conditions. I can specify all of this only by using something like a Tarski scheme. I mean, if I want to cover all his sentences and say what the truth conditions for all of them are, I need some way of organizing all that, and Tarski has shown us how to organize that.
Yes. Well, yes. What is Tarski's contribution here? What does it add? Of course, he brings out this point of disquotation to begin with.
Right.
There's a contribution in itself, although not involving nothing in the way of the logical, mathematical finesse that comes into his truth definition. But what does that add? Only well, two things, I'd say. For one thing, it makes for a finite definition of the class of true sentences, rather than this simply this plan, this formula of disquotation, which you can apply anywhere. Also, of course, it has the virtue of, since it does give a straightforward definition, the virtue of avoiding the paradox of the liar, and bringing out the hierarchical structure of truth. Now, where does that leave us?
Well, I see two other virtues. One of them is it brings out a feature of language which isn't brought out by disquotation, and that is how it is that you could understand a potential infinity of sentences given just a finite amount of information. And disquotation gives you no clue to that. And at the same time, of course, it brings out the relations between the truth conditions of different sentences. Seeing that this sentence is true under these conditions, this sentence under these conditions, you can then see, well, then, if this sentence is true, this one has to be true. So those relations are organized, let's say made explicit by a truth a definition of Tarski's sort, whereas this quotation does none of that
That's
for
true.
you.
Yeah.
May I add
No.
one more thing?
Yes.
If, unlike Tarski, we think of one of his definitions as attempting to be a definition for some actual language, I mean, for what somebody is doing, right? I mean, he's not worried about that, but I'm going to worry about it. I'm thinking of trying to organize what I know about somebody else's speech by giving a Tarski-type definition, or let's say just a theory. Leave out the last step of it. But now it's an empirical theory, right? If he says so-and-so, it's going to be true, if and only if so-and-so. That itself is true or false. Now, according to Tarski, the totality of the T sentences is the test of the correctness of a truth definition. Let me now say the test of the correctness of my theory about what somebody else means is whether my T sentences are right. But how can I tell whether they're right? Well, you've made a lot of wonderful suggestions. I'll take the observation sentences. I can tell whether I've got them right up to a point by seeing under what circumstances he's inclined to assent to or dissent from these sentences and so forth. We have a way with the logical constants, and then there's some hand waving of a good sort when it comes to the theoretical ones. Now that's how I test my empirical theory about somebody else, that is, whether I've got it right. Now it seems to me all of that, since what I'm testing is a theory of truth, or for them, all of this is relevant to what I mean by the word true. It's this kind of information which can be tested in this way. It's how I apply the concept of truth to people.
Yes, it gives you the whole grammatical structure of the language, and it pairs off the basic lexicon, insofar as one can think of the language as having a limited basic lexicon. And if we put it that way, it goes forward without even the predicate true. That's what's coming out of Tarski's actual construction, isn't it? He's got the primitive. He's got the simple predicates, and he's got the modes of combination into longer contexts.
We can get rid of the word true for any particular language.
Yes.
But we can't get rid of it in general.
No.
We want what we do for different people to be the same sort of thing. I mean, we don't want to say, here's this predicate we can eliminate for each language, but I don't know if there's anything in common between these.
We can. Does this say more than that we can carry out parallel analyses in terms of recursion over grammatical structures of one language and another, any languages, relative to our own? We find out how to translate this and that mode of combination, and we're just translating. But our standard then of whether each of these steps is right will depend on truth in the sense of our depending, a sense of it's depending on whether we would affirm the one sentence when we affirm the other.
Well, it seems to me we're doing something you say just translating, but not any old way. We're doing it by connecting their utterances with things we observe in the world.
And it's what you're doing in your radical interpretation.
Sure, yeah, but we don't do it any old way. We do it so as to get truth conditions.
What I can see there that makes a difference is that, yes, we're doing it extensionally, rather than insisting that these sentences, each step, not only be both true or both false, but necessarily so. We're and of course I'm all for that. We're bypassing the modalities.
Yeah. Oh, right. I'm just trying to put the case for the idea that we understand the concept of truth independent of disquotation. And that comes out, it seems to me, in what it is we think we're doing or are trying to do when we translate. To put it in the context of the way you're thinking of it. I mean, why do we translate one way rather than another? We look to, we want to translate their sentence has these truth conditions with one of our own that has these truth conditions. Give or take the kind of slack that indeterminacy introduces. The question is, do we have a lot of different concepts which come under the word true, or do we have one which we're applying in many cases? It seems to me quite clear that Tarski thought there's just one.
Yes, I would.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's transcendence for you.
Yes, that takes care of transcendence.
Okay, then I'd like to open to questions. In this instance, first hand up, David, followed by Brian.
I'm David Papino. I want to go back to the happy agreement to reject a certain conception of empiricism. And I don't think any of us want to resuscitate sense data or limit the given or anything like that, but I was a bit uneasy about the way you characterized what you both agreed you wanted to reject, because it seemed to me you were in danger of denying something that was true. You characterized what you wanted to reject as an intermediary between belief and the outside world that might play some kind of epistemological role. But it seemed to me clear that there are such things, despite what you said. Not sense data perhaps, but think of the case where somebody knowingly experiences an illusion. Somebody looks at the Muller-Lyer lines when the arrows are pointing outwards and inwards. And there's two lines of the same length, and you look at them and you judge that they're different lengths. In a sense, you perceptually judge that they're different lengths, even though you know, because you've seen the trick a number of times before, that they're the same length. So there seems to be a case that there is something in between my belief that they're the same length, namely my perceptual judgment that they're different lengths. And perhaps that perceptual judgment plays a justificatory role, not an indefeasible one, because in this kind of case, of course, we override it, but in a normal case, we do form beliefs, it seems, on the basis of just such perceptual judgments. So I wanted to know what either or both of you would say about that, given what you wanted to reject, sense data and method of given.
Well, I don't understand this use of the phrase judgment. Can I judge something to be the case but think it's not?
I was just looking for a neutral word to capture what seems to be true. In some sense, it seems to me, it strikes me, that these lines are different lengths.
Well, of course you can judge that it looks that way, right? That one looks longer than the other, but I don't think it is. Those are two judgments, both caused by looking. But what's the intermediary? We've got our sense senses are stimulated and we arrive at beliefs. I don't see any epistemic intermediary there.
So that's one way of doing it. Would Professor Quine do it the same way, I wonder?
Well, yes, I think it's the same thing. That our immediate unconsidered reaction is typical of our immediate perceptual judgments. But then it happens occasionally, and this is the special interest of this illusion, I think, that there can be, in pretty short order, a conflict between perceptual judgments, and this conflict is theoretical at a very low level of theory. And the whole thing can happen, of course, in the space of a minute or two. But one way or another, of course, a certain amount of inference goes into our perceptions anyway. Some of it is undoubtedly instinctive. It's where instinct gives us a head start on our thinking. And in other cases, there's some rudimentary thinking involved, and this certainly shows how the perception itself isn't as raw as one would be inclined to suppose it.
My name's Brian McGee, and I'd like to ask Donald Davidson what's wrong with the following. If I'm having an experience which I would ordinarily describe as looking at a green disc, and somebody says to me, you are looking at a red disc, I know, I feel justified in asserting that the statement is false, and I think I know that the statement is false. The relationship between the experience and the statement isn't a logical one, because logical relationships can obtain only between formulations in a symbolism. So here I have justification of a knowledge claim, justification of a statement, but it's not logical justification.
Well, what is the justification?
Well, that is, of course, one of the fundamental questions of philosophy, but I think that my question implies an exemplification of what the relationship is between experience and knowledge claims, or can be.
Well, I think that sounds all right. The trouble has always been to make sense of the idea that the experience, which has no propositional content in itself, justifies the belief that you arrive at. And I don't know of anybody who has ever succeeded in giving an account of that, because it requires this epistemic intermediary that we can't really, it's neither fish nor fowl. So I think, sure, we're justified, but we're justified because most of our direct perceptual judgments are true. And the explanation for that is not because they're based upon something else. It's rather based upon an account of how they come to have the contents they do.
I would say that we're not justified in saying that we haven't got justification because we can't give an account of it. We have got justification, and we know we've got it, but we can't give an account of it.
Well, I think we can. But the justification is not of the sort of finding some little element or some magic thing in experience which does the justifying. The justification comes in the explanation for why our perceptual beliefs, the ones that are most immediately caused by the world, why they tend overwhelmingly to be true. So the justification isn't of that particular belief in terms of something else. It's rather that kind of judgment is usually right. And now we need to know why, and I think we can say why. I'm not trying now because that's another story, but I think justification doesn't always carry you back one further step to something more basic.
Yes, Colin Howson. Both of our distinguished speakers credit Tarski with a fundamental role in the analysis of truth, presumably for natural language as well as for formalized languages. I wonder what they would think to the following consideration, that the person who said to say of what is that it is true, to say of what it is that it is true, and to say of what is that it is not is false, and then the other two variations, has given in that a quite precise and clear account of truth for natural languages, and that what Tarski did was to do something to give an account of truth for languages, unlike natural languages, which were capable of variable interpretations. So the Tarski definition is an account of how you take a semantics and then give the truth conditions under a whole class of different interpretations of that particular syntax. And that doesn't seem to me to add anything to the notion of truth as far as it's concerned with natural language. I'd like to know their opinion.
Well, the disquotation matter, Tarski certainly wouldn't feel particularly creative about that. I think the value of that is just that he brings out emphatically and in the open the sort of thing that does cover the whole ground. But where his prowess comes in is in setting up a recursive definition that covers the ground in a finite space. Whereas if we left it at the level of disquotation, there are infinitely many sentences that could be disquoted, and so a finite definition wouldn't be forthcoming. I see Tarski's definition of truth as having the virtue of putting the truth, putting the predicate into explicit, finite, and eliminable form, and of course, incidentally, because of the paradoxes, Tarski's definition shows that you have to take truth in a hierarchical way, and that there are more and more comprehensive truth predicates, but no limit, no most comprehensive, short of contradiction. This is where I admire Tarski's result.
Maybe I could say something about that. Tarski himself gives a number of extremely informal characterizations of the ordinary notion of truth. And he, among others, he quotes Aristotle, as you just did. I recently wrote a piece in which I said, I think Aristotle's characterization is better than Tarski's other informal characterizations for quite explicit reasons. Tarski's informal ones include ones which make it sound as though he thinks there's something that corresponds to a sentence that makes it true. The fact, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And one of the merits of his actual constructions is that, of course, there are no entities that correspond to sentences as a whole, except his infinite sequences, the satisfiers, so to speak. and they turn out not to be anything like facts, because if one sequence satisfies a closed sentence, so do they all. So there's no way of picking out the right fact, so to speak, in that way, anyway. And Aristotle's characterization also doesn't talk about something that corresponds to a sentence. And it's more like Tarski's actual work than Tarski's informal characterizations. But the informal characterization, of course, doesn't begin to do all the work. For one thing, it only covers sentences of certain forms. Curiously, though, that is, you could say it covers just those that start with an existential quantifier or the negation of an existential quantifier. Now, actually, the main example that Tarski gives is of languages that do all start that way, because he doesn't have any proper names and so forth. But of course, it tells us, I mean, the Aristotelian characterization tells us nothing about how truth is passed around, so to speak, in a language, even given the sentential connectives. Maybe negation would be the only one. Right? It tells a little bit about negation, but not much. But nothing about conjunction, alternation, and so forth. None of the work, so to speak, that a Tarski-type truth definition does in telling us how the truth, given finite information about a few cases, we can extend that now to an infinite number of cases, which tells us the kind of articulation that not only artificial languages, the kind he was talking about, have, but so do natural languages. They have all those devices, and he's given us a systematic way of thinking about them and coping with them.
Yes, I took a different attitude towards that informal part of the Tarski's thing. I took that as his generously ministering to the vulgar mind before doing the kind of thing that he saw to be really needed, namely not recognizing such entities as facts.
Well, good, but I think he also, I mean, it's quite clear, I think, was trying to persuade people that what he was going to go on to define was what they were interested in when they talked about truth.
Good, yeah, he was. Mm-hmm.
I'd let Colin come back on that finally. Okay, you want to come back on that, and then I think we'll wrap it up. Okay, Colin.
Yes, I was slightly worried about Professor Quine talking about one of the virtues being the recursion in the definition of truth, because it's very difficult to think of how you would have a recursive definition for a natural language, because you just simply don't have the atomic versus molecular structure that's given in a natural language. I also wonder about the unequivocal nature of the Tarski theorem that says you have a hierarchical structure of truth. After all, there have been people, for example, Kripke, who, as it were, brought down even for a formalized language, the truth predicate into the language, and showed how you could do that consistently simply by having truth value gaps. So it doesn't seem to me, as I say, an unequivocal verdict that Tarski showed that there was a hierarchy of truth predicates.
No, I think not, and I don't think that Tarski would have said so either. I certainly prefer Tarski's. It's more elegant. It enables us to adhere to our standard, you might say, neoclassical logic, which has the virtue of simplicity and being so thoroughly understood. But certainly truth value gaps could accomplish the same thing. And I think Kripke's proposal comes out rather less convenient by a good deal. Yes, and I don't. Well, I would expect Tarski to say substantially the same.
Yeah, I would.